Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Communitech Data Hub, and welcome to our online viewers as well. My name is Kusha, and I work with Communitech. So before we start, we're going to try something. I'd like to ask those of you who are hiring to put up your hands. Oh, 1, 2. That's it? Okay. And those of you who are looking for work, put up your hands. Oh, there's a couple of you. Okay. So now that you know each other, feel free to connect afterwards. And onwards to business. So I'm pleased to introduce today's speaker. So Tessa Sproul is co-founder and CEO of Vubble, and she's a digital innovator, a visionary leader, and a change agent with an intense clarity of vision about the future and the technologies that are coming. Welcome, Tessa.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you all for having me. And I hope everybody's got a sandwich or something to eat. I am going to get this to open. And I'm going to put this in my pocket. All right. So it is time to talk about ethics in artificial intelligence. And in order to talk about ethics in artificial intelligence, the first place that we have to start is actually defining what we mean by what artificial intelligence is. And it is not one thing. It is really a constellation of a number of things. It's machine learning. You've probably heard that before. It is algorithms. It is data collection. I would consider part of the artificial intelligence universe. It's data processing and the choices that we make in how that data is collected and what we do with it. It isn't something that just happens inside of a computer. It's actually happening, interfacing with people who are deciding things, people who are making choices, people who are sorting things, and people who are wanting to want things, that they have an impulse that they want to inject their AI to do for them. It's deeply personal AI, I think. Without us, without our inputs, it actually wouldn't work. It uses your information. It's not something happening by itself in a computer somewhere. It's happening because of how you're interacting with it. It's what you've shared, knowingly or not. And it's what the people behind it think is important. So those are just some ideas I want you to think about as we're going forward. For me, it became deeply, deeply personal. About 2013, I was the director of digital at CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. And I was becoming increasingly worried about how, in a post-broadcast media space, we were relying on algorithms largely run by one company in Silicon Valley to decide what people would see and what they would care about and what they would engage with and be informed about. As a public broadcaster, that really concerned me, because if we don't have a public sphere that has a shared knowledge of important information, how do we actually define policy advances or decide what's important about how we respond to an issue out in the world? I was very worried as well about this fast driving tunnel that we were going through, leading to clickbait, because those algorithms, the one that I described run by one Silicon Valley company, was largely rewarding things that were getting viral. So that's why we saw stuff like clickbait happen in the media industry, because that was the only way that those companies that were producing that content could stay alive. I was also very worried about misinformation, because we could see that stuff that was tabloidy was really selling at the time. This is before the 2016 election too. And I was just very concerned about how the media industry itself is going to get through all of this and come out the other end doing what it's meant to do, which is be the filter through which the world sees its place and understand what is meaningful around it. Actually, I'll go back to that picture for a second. So that's 2013, that's me crying. I ended up leaving the CBC because I found that legacy media organizations weren't moving quickly enough to figure out how to resolve this. So I started a Vubble with my co-founder, Katie McGuire, who's sitting over there, who lives in Waterloo, so you can come and talk to her as well. She's often in this building. So AI is not a tool, a technology tool when it comes to media, I don't think. It is the master of our attention. That's how it's being used by media organizations. I want you to think about something called attentional control. It's something that's actually happening in your brain right now. If I clap like that, you're like, oh, she just clapped. That is your brain saying innately what to pay attention to. It's in our blood, it's in our DNA, it's in our psychosis. It was really important to have that when we were out wandering around foraging. If you saw a bear, you would know what to do, right? Ignore everything else, there's a bear. It is more problematic in a world where our attention is able to be essentially commodified. Today we live in a world where AI's use of technology is driven by the attention economy. If you're interested in this space, please just type in attention economy in Google. There's a guy named Tristan Harris, who's a former ethicist with Google, who's done really fantastic work around this. Essentially, the idea around the attention economy is that we are being bought our attention through our likes, through our shares, and the most viral thing wins. We know what happens when that happens, right? The most viral thing tends to be the most extreme. The things that really anger us travel fastest and furthest. The single most popular news story of the entire 2016 US election was this one: Pope Francis shocks the world, endorses Donald Trump for president. That was a lie fabricated by Macedonian teenagers. 3 times as many Americans read and shared it on their social media accounts as any article from the New York Times. In the final 3 months of the 2016 election campaign, just a second, sorry, more fake political headlines were shared on Facebook than real ones. So when we pay attention to something that has more likes, or that has more hearts, or it has more claps on Medium, at the expense of really important things, we're really making decisions about what's a priority. We're actually rewiring our brains, and we're determining which voices are to be heard and whose facts are to dominate. And now we carry these propaganda machines around in our pockets. They're propaganda megaphones, and the algorithms are engineered towards deeply personalized experiences that are designed to ratchet up your attention and consumption, feeding us more and more of the stuff that we like, the things that push our buttons, the things that grab our attention. We're kind of starving in the midst of plenty. In media and with other industries, we often think of technology or automation as something neutral. It's just technology. It's just happening. It's innocuous and neutral. The straightforward consequence of technological process, and it is not. Online, just as in offline, attention and influence largely gather around those who already have both. A few giant companies remain the gatekeepers, while the worst habits of the old media model, the pressure towards quick celebrity, to be sensational above everything else, have proliferated in the ad-driven model. So technology's posture is to deny its own impact. Well, we're just a platform. But the effects are really deep, they're real, and they're troubling. Just because the internet is open doesn't mean that it's equal. Offline hierarchies carry over to the online world and are even amplified there. So a really obvious and profoundly troubling example of this is when we start talking about AI-driven facial recognition. So for dark-skinned people, for dark-skinned women, existing AI image software has a 35% error rate. For darker-skinned men, it has a 12% error rate. The Caucasian error rate, unsurprisingly, is much lower than either of those. And you can guess what happens when you add something like predictive policing to that scenario. Non-profit journalists at the ProPublica have audited risk assessment software used by the American courts and justice system to determine that the likelihood of a convicted criminal would reoffend, and found that the system routinely and wrongly predicted black convicts. Kind of unsurprising, because if you actually go back and follow not follow the money, but follow the data to its source, it's largely from police records, human collected police records, that are the signals that are used by the AI in these models. And those are polluted already with bias and racism. I really want you to check this out. ProPublica is a nonprofit organization in the States, and they've done fantastic work in this space. And we'll be sharing this document later, so you'll be able to find the link directly if you'd like. And we've also got an article version of this presentation on Medium that you can check out and click directly there to check it out. Now, here's a big secret. It's not a secret at all. If you're working in the industry, you probably already know this, but big tech already knows about the limits of the technology. Humans are needed to intervene at points. What they don't tell us and what they don't show us and what they fail to show us that's happening behind the curtain is the labor of humans that are going into this. So this is a fantastic documentary called The Moderators. It's from 2017 by Adrian Chen and Karen Cassidy, and it gives a deep look into the workers who are basically screening and censoring digital content. Hundreds and thousands of people work in this field. They're looking at beheadings, they're looking at rape, they're looking at horrible animal torture and other incredibly terrifying and disgusting things that they physically have to look at because the technology can't do it. There are more people that work in this space than all of Google and Facebook combined, which is quite incredible when you think about that. We're kind of offsetting our PTSD to lower paid folks that are doing this in essentially moderation farms. So I get it. AI can be used in incredibly positive ways, and we're trying to do that ourselves at our company. You can use it to monitor heart and predict health issues. You could use it even with monitoring on a wristwatch. You could maybe predict a mental health episode that somebody might have, which is a fantastic use of the technology. You could use facial recognition software to identify a missing child wandering on a street. You could use it to identify a terrorist in a crowd, which is also fantastic use of it. It can predict with better accuracy than a human doctor the likelihood of skin cancer based on an image of a mole, which is phenomenally incredible. But as we know, tools can also be used in negative ways. So AI can be used in deeply damaging ways, damaging to freedoms, human rights, and our understanding of ourselves. It can be used to track you without your permission or knowledge. It might sell your interests to marketers about the shoes that you looked at in the window, and it could predict whether or not you're likely going to get cancer to your potential life insurance provider. It could tell your boss if you're buying too much beer, and it could tell the police whether or not it thinks you're going to do something bad. That's already happening. Look at what's happening in China right now. If you look at the social credit system, which is a weird euphemism for essentially use of AI that is going to, it's straight out of Black Mirror if you've seen the episode where you're basically allowed to do things like travel on a plane if you've got a certain level of social credit. This is happening in real time, real life, right now in China. If we want the internet to be truly a people's platform, and I honestly, truly, in my lifeblood, think that we do, we can disagree. I'd love to have that after if we want to do that. We have to make it so. We are very lucky to live in a privileged, advanced democratic country. We need to call on our elected representatives on issues that require the balancing of public safety with our democratic freedoms. Artificial intelligence requires the public and private sectors alike to step up and to act. I'm not saying that the internet needs to be regulated, but big technology corporations need to be the subject of governmental oversight. They are reaching further and further into our private moments. They are watching us, and we need to be watching them as well. I am for regulating very specific things, like internet access. I'm a huge proponent of net neutrality, and stronger protections and restrictions to the data gathering, retention, and use by companies in Canada and outside. The better that we can get in front of the social consequences of AI, the better for all of us. I know it sounds really weird for a company, an entrepreneur, to ask for government regulation of its products. It's kind of heretical. But at Bubble, we believe that thoughtful regulation actually contributes to a healthier ecosystem for consumers and the producers alike. We advocate for what we call technocracy, a technocracy approach, the production of technology that doesn't just feed our business. We want to do that, but not just that, but also helps our customers and does good for society to make it better for a better place for us all. We can also take a step and just a pause and think about how the auto industry spent decades in the 20th century resisting calls for regulation. But today we fully appreciate the role that regulations have played in making us safer. So as Janet Tifficky put it very bluntly and effectively, Facebook is only 13 years old, Twitter is 11, and Google is but 9. At this moment in the evolution of the auto industry, there were still no seatbelts, no airbags, no emission controls, or mandatory crumple zones. We can do this, and we need to do this, and we have to do it now. The issue at stake is nothing less than what kind of society we want to be living in the future and what we want our children to be living in. It is not enough to just build it. We need to think it through. What does it mean to be a leader in a responsible development and use of artificial intelligence? Will you join us? So I'm going to share with you some of the things that our company is thinking about. We have 9 main issues. I couldn't get to 10. Maybe together we can come up with a 10th, or maybe we can edit it down into a smaller list. But and this is what I want to talk with you all about after, plus anything else that you disagree with on what I've already talked about. So what we're looking at is consulting with an ethicist, maybe hiring one full-time if we had the resources to do that, that would be able to help us answer really impactful questions like, is our artificial intelligence leveling the playing field? What are the potential negative consequences of using it? What are the potential negative consequences of not using it? So if you can put that into your own company, into your own business, or into your own work and think through that, I think that's an incredibly important first step. We also are working on developing an ethics code that lays out just how issues would be handled around things that we can't even imagine yet. We want to have an AI review board, so if anybody's interested in helping us there, come and join me after, working to address the ethical questions on an ongoing basis. We want to really reward showing how it works. People throw around the word transparency. We want to make it completely transparent, show how it works. We also hear a lot about explainable AI. We want to make clear what are the parameters that are being assessed by our machine learning and how are those parameters being weighted. And we want to make that obvious to not just ourselves, but the people who are being used by it or are using it. We want to develop annotated coding trails that show how the programming decisions have been made. So when I talked about the use of the AI in the ProPublica example of it being used in predicting whether or not criminals will reoffend, you could actually trace that back if you'd followed where the various points were, where things were being weighted in that machine learning. I think it's incredibly important for companies to do that, not just when they're doing important social work like that, but even if you're doing something mundane, having a trail of what the decision-making around your AI is, I think is incredibly crucial. Implementing training programs for our own employees that operationalize ethical considerations is a hugely important piece as well. I don't want people to just be thinking if they're working with us that it's all okay and kosher. I want them to feel that they're also invested in it and they can contribute to interrogating it and, moving it forward as well. We want to build a diverse team that's enabled and invited to interrogate that decision-making in AI. So we firmly believe that our AI and all AI should reflect the diversity of the users that it serves. We also want to figure out what is the plan for mediation in those cases where AI ends up inflicting harm or damages to people, because it will happen. AI must be held to account, and so must its developers and builders. Not entirely sure how or what that means right now, but we have to figure out the first step around that now. And then here's another point, too, that I think is critical. How does our AI both replace, in terms of automation, and also create, in terms of other work for folks? Because that's the other thing that we're deeply concerned about as well as we enter into this fourth age. Who's going to get displaced in all of this, and where can we still have that human intervention in the work that we do? So that list, by no means, is exhaustive. It's only 9. Help me get to 10, or let's whittle some out if you think that some of them are redundant. But I think they're illustrative of the breadth of the issue and what's really involved in the choices that we have to be making now. And there's a role for you and the public at large to play in this as well, critiquing and voting both with wallets and attention and holding all of us to account in terms of how we're using AI in our businesses or in our daily lives and the work that we do. Self-regulation is no substitute for public judgment. So I've talked about regulation, but really listening and hearing what your consumers or what your audience or what the people who are using your product are doing is so critical at this point. And we're starting to hear, we're actually part of the tech backlash that we're starting to hear is people are waking up to this and realizing, wait, it's not what I signed on for. You have to be listening to what that is and what are the sensitivities and what are the pain points that people are having with the technology that you're putting out into the world. So please, let's encourage folks to interrogate the AI that is used in their lives. Let's let them speak up and let them know let us know how we're doing and hold us to account as well. So now, I know we've got the cube, wherever it is. Oh, there it is. And I would love for us to get into a conversation of ethics in AI, how it works with your life We're going to throw the cube around. If you could make sure you speak into it so that folks not in the room can also hear.
Hi.
Hi.
So if we're going to be adding a bunch of regulations, et cetera, to people using AI,
Specific regulations.
I imagine that startups in particular will really feel pained by that. They don't have that much money, that much resources to spend time building audit trails, algorithms to do this, databases to do it. But we still need to do it. What can we as a community or the government or just at large everyone do to make it easier? Should we be building infrastructure that's open and free for people to use to make it easier?
I would love that, and I would love that to be done not just by big tech platforms, but something that's more of an open resource for everyone to use. I'd look to our, either nonprofit or an agency like CBC, something like that in the media space. I would love if they would work kind of like a BBC model, doing that very thing, creating things that people can sign on to, giving access to tools or to insight or to resources that they'd be able to employ. I get the point around being a startup and not having infinite resources or any resources, but I actually kind of imagine it as, if you think about this stuff when you're setting it up, you're actually limiting everything to a point where it feels more manageable. In startup world, we can often feel like, oh my God, I'm doing everything. I'm spitting everywhere in the world and nothing's happening. If you actually confine it down to a sandbox and feel like, oh, I get this, and I understand, I think it would actually be helpful for a lot of startups to have that confinement, which sounds kind of antithetical, but I think it actually, there's great creativity in limitation, I think.
Thanks.
Hi there. I think it was your point number 2, said that we should be looking at trying to find ethicists. Oh, no, maybe it was 3 then.
Point number 1.
1, ethicists. So I'm just wondering, where do you find these people? What kind of credentials does someone need to be an ethicist?
It doesn't have to be like somebody who's got their master's. Maybe somebody who does have their master's would say it does, but I think somebody that you trust, that you believe understands what you're trying to do and isn't coming at it from, okay, what are you going to sell to be able to get there, but it's coming at it from, what does this mean for folks that you might not be thinking about, right?
So a cynic. Maybe.
Perhaps, yeah, no, totally. That's totally right. Somebody that you can hire on as the person that's going to, basically kick you in the pants and say, why? Why would you do it that way,
So really, that's a skill set that's widely shared over the world, right? Are you worried about snake oil salesmen showing up saying,
Well, that's up to you to make sure that you get the right person that you trust for the right reasons, giving you advice, right?
Sure.
But I feel like this is a critical, it could be, our CFO is really good in this space too. And our privacy person is really good in this space. So if you've surrounded yourself with folks that are not just thinking about how are we going to get the next sale in or how are we going to get the next million users, but is thinking about at what cost are we doing that and how we're getting there and are we doing the right things and getting there. I think that's a value that is important for a lot of folks to be considering as they're building their companies.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Anyone?
Hi there. I was thinking about algorithms and the things people use and being open about that when so many companies are going to be, oh, this is ours and we're not sharing it. Do you see that as a legislative issue?
So it is in some countries. In Germany, you have to open up the black box if you want to operate there. Some nations are actually saying explicitly, if you want to be here, you've got to show us what's going on under the hood. I think for companies, like our company, we want to be as transparent. It's a bit of a catchphrase, but as transparent as possible. It's hard to do that because how do you actually articulate this stuff and how do you spend your time and attention explaining to folks? But it's a critical thing to do. So yeah, there are companies that would say, no, we'll never let you see because this is the lifeblood of our company. We're approaching it very differently, and we're with the clients that we work with, we're saying, work with us, but we're radical about how we will show people how it's working because it's important for people to understand how these choices are being made. If we're in the media space, when we're in a newsroom, I explain to them if they're using AI for distribution of their content, that's no different than having an automated lineup producer. The lineup producer is the person that decides what happens in a newscast. Essentially, we've automated that process, that position, by using AI in a newsroom. If you don't know how it works and you're the publisher or the head of the network or whatever, shame on you. You have to know how that works internally, and I think it's your prerogative to let your audience know externally why those decisions are being made. It's okay if it's being made to sell ads. Just be overt about making that choice and letting them know that.
Thanks.
Anybody? Throw the cube around. Oh, I think there's somebody at the very, very back. Have you got a good arm?
We'll see how that goes.
I love this. Oh, wow, good catch. Hi.
So the things that you're talking about AI, I don't think, there's nothing about AI. They don't seem to actually relate to AI. They sort of seem to relate to tech in general. You could use the same kinds of values
You
for like
could.
basically any tech company.
You could. When we're talking about AI, though, we're talking about these black boxes. You know, the Netflix algorithm or the Facebook algorithm is one that is essentially determining what people see in their feed every day and is largely defining how informed a population is around issues, right? And so when we talk about that use of AI and AI at the meta level, I'm really talking about the machine learning where Facebook is looking at what I've clicked on in the past and then trying to feed me more of that to get my eyeballs to see more ads, right? So when we're talking about this, we're talking about the choices that are made in that machine learning, understanding why you're allowing your system to make those choices. Facebook's not going to do that. I would advocate that companies that are building right now, that are looking forward to the future, should be doing that, making that overt, letting people understand how those decisions are being made. And essentially, the machine learning side of it, it's just databases, right? It's databases with cells, and somebody's making a decision, maybe several people are making decisions about the weight behind certain columns in those cells. That's it. It is not like this crazy rocket science side of things, but those choices that are being made have profound impact, is what I'm saying.
So are you saying that so for a company, is it only the decisions of the weights that humans are making that counts, or is it actually sort of, are you hoping for the decisions that the algorithms themselves are making?
It should be both. If you're actually you're making decisions as a programmer to decide this column has a certain weight, and then you're not looking at the other end with what the predictions are that are coming out of it. If it's predicting that this person's likely going to reoffend as a criminal or whatever, and you're not auditing that, you're not understanding how, when you've put it into the machine learning, what is happening in the various steps after that, then that's a huge problem, I would say. Good catch.
Sort of to follow on to that question, maybe it's worth asking, what is it about AI and machine learning that requires that we put it under more of a microscope from an ethics perspective than just technology in general?
I think it's partially because the posture that technology companies have taken so far is that it's innocuous and that it's neutral and it's just technology making these choices, when that's not the case. What's really happening is people are making choices around what is the data set, is maybe one of the first choices that's made. Then the second choice could be, what weight am I giving to particular aspects within that data set? A third choice would be, how are we interpreting that? And making that obvious and understood and transparent is part of what we're discussing.
But it seems to me like the issue is that we have these fairly complex decisions being made by a bunch of inputs, including the data sets that humans are deciding on, with an outcome that isn't necessarily obvious. And is that the problem, that there's a bit of a disconnect there?
Could be, but we're also making it because humans can't do it at the scale, right? So in the media space, that's why the clients that work with us are working with us, because they want to be able to have an automated process of distribution of content, because they can't have one lineup editor per person to say, oh, this is what you'll probably like, or this is what you'll like, right? And so being able to do it at scale is the thing that is both the magic of being able to use incredible tools in the AI space, but also potentially the detriment, because you could have huge impact that you aren't even potentially aware of in doing it.
So maybe the problem is that people are kind of washing their hands of ethical dilemmas that we used to be faced with all the time in making
Absolutely.
decisions. And okay, I think it makes
In a
sense.
newsroom, you're like, are we just leading because it's bleeding? Those are questions that are asked in a newsroom all the time. If we're obfuscating that to a machine and saying, oh, that's not our problem anymore. That's a deliberate choice that's being made in the media context that I have a problem with.
All right, thanks.
Hi.
All right, I'm trying to boil down one of the points you made, and I think it's, we've got to hold somebody accountable for letting this stuff run free, right? And so I'm trying to think of, well, who is it that we hold accountable, and how do we do that? I mean, you're trying to promote us taking it to the street and letting, making sure that they are doing good by what they're trying to do with this technology. So what do you want us to do?
So I want you to think about it a little bit longer than just, like move fast and break things. It's great to be living in that space, but we're growing up now, right? We're actually advancing in ways that are having profound impacts. So we can't just move fast and break things anymore. We have to be thinking about what are the implications of this thing that I'm putting out into the world, and are there any negatives? Are there any positives? And I'm not saying that we're going to be able to answer it and get ahead of everything, but to be able to have the responsibility and the accountability is part of what we need to be doing. To be able to just say, no, it's just technology, don't worry, it's happening over in a machine over there, is problematic.
So I think I caught a whiff of government intervention and that kind of stuff, right? Is that a good approach, do you think? Or like legislating sort of controls on these things?
Well, I think something, so again, I always go back to the media examples because they're closest to me, but something like, if Facebook says our algorithm is being used to identify hate speech or whatever, but it's actually not effective and it's not working, and we don't even know how it's making the choices of what is hate speech or how is it identifying hate speech, that's problematic. I think that should be open. I think it should be interrogated. I think people should be able to have insight into how those systems are being coded and developed and made. Again, and also when you start talking about transferring through borders and different cultures, it becomes really problematic. With other examples like driverless cars. So AI is phenomenal. It's going to help us to decrease traffic accidents. I love all of that. The fact that people are terrible drivers for the most part, and computers could do a better job, and machine learning could do a better job. I agree. You start to get into the ethics of it, though, when you've probably heard about the tunnel problem, where there's a car moving fast down a tunnel, driverless car, sorry, and the car is going very quickly, and right at the very last millisecond, a child runs out in front of the car. And the car has to decide whether or not it's going to hit the child or slam into the wall of the tunnel, likely killing the driver and any other passengers in the car. So we can say, okay, well, maybe we can come up with some sort of ethical rationale for what choice the car makes at that point. Then you start thinking about it a little bit further, though, and you're like, well, what about where the car is? If this car is in Saudi Arabia and that child is a girl, that's a different scenario. And who writes that code? Who's responsible for making that choice? Is that written by the nation state, or is it written by the company that wrote the code in Silicon Valley? And are they responsible for the choices that car then makes in the world? It becomes, it feels like, heavy and cloudy and weird, but these are the things that I think we have to be thinking about as I don't know what your company does, if you have a company, what you're using your AI for, thinking through what are the ways that it could be used for good, and what are the ways that it might be used in a negative way, and trying to mitigate the latter so that it has less impact.
And one more follow to that, right? I mean, we've used the classic examples of Facebook and Google and Amazon and all these things, but I mean, those are public companies, right? And by under our current legal system, are really accountable only to their shareholders. So if we want
or by money too, like Germany slapping on big, huge
and it comes back to my
disincentives.
original question. I mean, what kind of pressure do we need to put on these places, and how do we do that?
I think it's happening right now.
Yeah.
It is happening right now when you see these companies being, brought in front of Congress in the States and going before decision makers and legislators in the UK and Germany as well. I think that has to happen. I think the education piece of why I'm advocating for everybody to have explainable AI, so that you both understand it internally in your work and your culture, but also you're explaining to your customers how it's being used and how they're potentially being used by it as well, which isn't necessarily a negative thing. It can be enormously helpful. I love that a robot can clean my floor or whatever, right? But we have to be thinking about how to help people understand how it, because it's not happening in isolation. It's having enormous impact on people's lives, from the justice side to health to what we have in our heads in terms of information. It's having deep and meaningful impact. So I firmly believe that if that's the case, we should be thinking about where are the spots that we need human intervention and regulatory intervention.
Thank you. Oh, there. I can do this.
Hi. So a couple weeks ago, we had a panel session on responsible AI, and one of the topics that came up was the university's role and the role of ethics researchers in sort of auditing these algorithms and the type of work that they can do to help. What do you see that role being?
I think it's anything that we can do that's interdisciplinary as well, where you can have folks coming into, no one can imagine the potential negatives until you actually have folks saying, well, what if it was used this way? So I think that's a huge piece. Research involved in that would be enormously helpful. I think, and to the point around the diversity of when you're setting up how you're using your machine learning or interrogating it, if you're going to do any auditing of it, having diversity in that scenario is critical, because if it's just you making choices, you've made this baby, you love it, and it's perfect. And how are you going to be able to, poke at it in significant ways? Diversity in terms of representation of the customers that are at the other end of your tool, your machine learning, your AI, whatever it is that you're doing, is critical.
So there's just a question that came from someone online.
Great.
This actually came up in our November 7th Responsible AI panel as well. So the person's saying, what about an FDA-type organization for algorithms? Andrew Tutt put out a position paper on this topic. For those AI applications that have a high potential for negative consequences, you could have an independent body that could review the black box while maintaining privacy and not disclosing the intellectual property. Yep. So they just want to know your thoughts on that.
I think that's definitely an approach that could be the perfect solution, to be able to do it where you're still able to mitigate the public organizations that don't want to reveal all and can't reveal all necessarily, but you want to be able to have insight into what's going on. I think that's a wonderful solution. The other thing that I would say too is having, we have laws already around hate crime and that kind of thing. Having the insight and creativity in the folks that are, enacting those laws so that they understand this is actually against Canadian hate crime laws or whatever, to be able to call on it and enforce existing laws through the lens of maybe it's a technology that's happening in a box far away, but being able to enact our existing laws is also incredibly important. I was speaking with the folks that are reviewing the Telecommunications Act in Canada and the Broadcast Act, and just the fact that you're calling it the Broadcast Act is insane to me, because that's not the world we live in anymore. And to me, that's part of, as they're rewriting those laws, having the imagination to think through, okay, we're not just talking about airwaves anymore. We're talking about different mechanisms that people are receiving, Canadians are receiving information content. So to me, the laws that they produce in reimagining what that legislation is should be considering this space, probably more than conventional broadcast and legacy systems.
Sorry.
Thank you. I'd be curious to get your thoughts on whether or not you think there are just some red lines that shouldn't be crossed. And I'm thinking in the context of military applications specifically, but if there are others as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, I was watching something from, I can't remember, I'm sorry, I forget her name, but she was on a panel from Google talking about this very thing. And they have a very public list of how they use AI, where their red lines are. I wish I knew the name of the document, but she referenced it. If you give me your information later, I'll send it to you. But it's a great list, and it outlines with great clarity where their red lines are, and one of them is in the military use space. So Yes, absolutely. And that's part of this whole thing, figuring out where do you draw the line and why. That's the ramification point of one of the points that I'm talking about. Like, what is our comfort level and where does it start to get ugly? Where we just want to wait and see, and we don't want to push too hard, and we want to wait and see what happens, and then build our thing out or let it out into the world.
Hi there.
Hi.
I'm not sure if you're aware, but a few years ago there was 2 sets of papers that came up, offshore papers and Panama Papers.
Yep.
And there are public data, and the International Consortium of Journalists that released those, we know that there's aggregate data that goes with that data that will actually track that data right back to the lawyer's source.
Yep.
And that's where the money is to be collected. Now, why is it taking so long for the revenue agency to tell us that it won't be until 2020 that we get that information when an AI program could pull it out tomorrow?
I don't know.
Would that be crossing the ethical red line?
I don't think, if it's sorting data and trying to figure out, follow the money things, like, I'm not against using AI, as long as you're saying, this is what we define as money, and this is the threshold of how much money requires for the signal then to be this or X or Y. I don't think that crosses any line. And
Yeah, I think it's doable.
yeah, I think being overt and transparent about what methodology I'm assuming you're talking about some sort of machine learning system that would be built to analyze what's going on in those papers, then as long as you're overt about it, I would imagine that organization in particular would be very transparent about it. Not so much with WikiLeaks, I don't think they would be.
Not so much the Toronto Star.
Well, I don't know.
Okay,
I don't
thank
know.
you.
Thanks. There's a really interesting follow-up to that one, too, where they just did, they released information about medical devices as well, the same organization. But, yeah. Anybody else? I think there's somebody at the back again.
Where's that?
I need one of those for my house. Hi again.
So, so the talk about regulating AI seems a little bit abstract. But you
Very
were talking
specific
about
pieces within AI.
but-
I'm
but
not talking about everything.
You were talking about the attention economy.
Yep.
So I think we have a problem with the attention economy.
I agree.
In the sense that I'm glued to my device, and lots of other people are. So there's a few regulations that I know of, like you're not supposed to text and drive, even though it happens a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Are there ways to even address that problem, which seems to be a more concrete problem that we're experiencing right now, where we're putting the onus on individuals to not be distracted as opposed to the phones or the companies? Like, is there any kind of framework that then by analogy I could use to understand how you would even approach the problem of controlling AI or...
So in the attention economy side of things, so Tristan Harris, the guy that I referenced earlier, who was a former ethicist with Google, he is advocating for some kinds of rules and structure around, because I'm not saying this is him saying this now, but we've heard the reference of big tech is the new big tobacco, right? And there is criticism that some companies have built devices and built software knowing the addictive traits of that software and technology. So I would imagine there are lots of folks that are advocating for regulation in that design element right now, the same way that we regulate addictive substances that can have negative consequences as well. Where you're talking about the, driver texting and that kind of thing, that's where I was kind of speaking around, like, enforcing the laws that we already have is, some element of this as well. But I think that we also need to have the imagination to understand, where is that? Like, is there a red line in there where we don't regulate the design of stuff? Or is there a line that we go to and we're like, yeah, no, it makes sense that we shouldn't allow, a device to, I don't know, listen for things in your home and then notify you something. Maybe that's the line, and we're not willing to cross it. Until we actually have conversations about this, and until we actually understand how these systems are working, we can't even have those conversations. I don't know if I've answered your question very well, but
Yeah, like, I mean, so it's not one company
No.
that's stealing all my attention necessarily.
No.
It's like there's 20 notifications on my phone from 20 different interesting things.
And you can turn notifications off, but there might be an update in the back end
So I
that
can
it's listening for things and
but then that's,
turning it back on
again,
again.
the onus is on me then, right?
And
I'm
maybe
the one
that's
who
not
has
the,
to
maybe
turn
it
it
shouldn't
off.
be. Maybe it shouldn't be. And that's
So
the
then it's
conversation that we need to be having. Where I feel like when I was talking to legislative folks earlier, they're like, oh, we can't possibly have that. We can't possibly ask these companies to do that. Why not? Why can't we? If it's actually directly involved with how we're seeing the world around us, and it's in our homes and it's listening, some of these devices are actually listening all the time. Why can't we have some sort of not just insight into how they're working, but some rules around how they work as well? I don't see why we can't.
I want to say thanks very much for your presentation.
Thanks.
I think that most people in this room are not even aware that they're actually being adversely affected by AI right now. So for example, if you're looking for a position in a company, if you're trying to get a loan from a bank, if you're trying to get your credit limit increased, third-party companies, these data aggregators are actually using this information against you. And perhaps the solution would be to look at what the actual demographics are as far as what the results kind of compared to us as a society, what we consider to be discriminatory, and then seeing if the results themselves are the problem. And then from there, we can start looking further into it.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. And I think that you're raising a very good point. Like, there might be lots of folks in the room that don't really understand how tools are potentially influencing the way that they're getting home today or whatever.
That's right.
And yeah, absolutely. I think there's a bunch of different spaces that we can collectively pinpoint. First of all, it's the data signals. What is the data that we're basing these machines on, that it's making references through? Then how are we coding them? What weighting bias are we adding to it? And some bias is okay. We just have to be aware of it and acknowledge that that's what it is, and maybe it changes over time. And then the interpretation of what the output is also another thing, that if you don't have human intervention at that point, like I said with the newsroom example, where if you have automated, algorithmically driven distribution of news from a newsroom, and you don't know how that machine is actually making the news piece go to you versus what comes to me, if no human in that room can actually identify what's going on there, that is a huge problem.
It is a huge problem. And again, I have personal experience seeing people actually, having issues getting things like loans or renting a home or getting a new position in the company because of these black box algorithms that we can't see within. And then if we could look at what some of the results are as a result of using these programs, someone's always trying to prove they're doing a job. Some pencil pusher, sorry for the pencil pushers in the room, some pencil pusher somewhere is always trying to prove that they're doing a better job by shaving a few points off here and there or by getting a better margin. And AI is being promoted as a solution of doing this. But the result being is that if people are not getting jobs based on their gender, and we saw this recently with Amazon, who had a bias in their own algorithms that was preventing women from being hired. Why there's not a massive lawsuit over this, I have no idea.
There may be.
I would hope so. But again, if we can just start off the approach to what you're talking about by looking at what the results are. Who is suffering as a result of these algorithms?
And who's winning.
And who's winning, exactly, yeah.
It's kind of like the old journalistic approach to it, like who's actually benefiting from this thing? If we can always be asking ourselves that question as we're engaging with things. And that's why in 2013 I was getting very anxious. So like all Facebook was doing at that point was really just trying to feed more of what we like. It's the whole filter bubble thing, right? So that they could sell ads. And that's okay if that's the model, right? But then if it has outweighed influence over what people actually understand about the world that's happening around them, and then it can be bought and sold by folks that have their own interests and bias, and all of it's happening in a closed box that nobody can see into, that's where it becomes really dangerous and problematic.
Very much so.
Yeah. Anyone else? I think there's one over there. if anybody is online that wants to ask anything again too, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, I
Hi.
just wanted to follow up on that because his point is very important, and that is it is about the aggregate data that keeps on getting added to it that creates what's called a persona, and then your persona can be hacked. You see, you are an identity that has so much data collected about you, but also you have friends, and your friends have data as well. And so all of these complicated things will determine whether you may not get a loan.
And they may not be friends, but they may just be sort of like you, or a system decides that they're kind of like you, which is what happens with the predictive policing model, right? Like, if we have enough data that says that person A or person that is like person A is likely to commit a crime,
And
then
a lot
person
of-
A is already committing a crime then. You know?
Exactly, and a lot of that is based on Interpol software.
Yep.
And so, so you realize that you might not get a loan for reasons that you have no explanation for.
Yeah.
So I'll just leave you with that.
And it becomes, like, we can look at lots of industries where that's happening in the health industry with insurance in the States. If you're an American trying to get insurance and you've got a device on your wrist that's tracking your health habits.
Well, what we discovered is that if you go to Malaysia or Singapore, you can buy real estate here without going through any of the processes of what you call income verification.
Right.
It's pretty important.
Yeah. And I think I really quickly referenced what's happening in China, but I think it's a really stark example of what's happening now, where, yeah, it's based on how you're interacting with the world around you. The machine, the system, is actually giving you credits or taking credits away. Who was it? There was a documentary that I just watched the other day. I'll add it to an email. I'll send it to Jacqueline. But it was fantastic because it was an investigative journalist based in, I want to say, Beijing. But he's basically, his social score has gotten so low because he was, following the money and calling out some bureaucrats for bad behavior, and now he can't go anywhere. His wife's own credit score social credit score has gone down as well, so they're really struggling to feed their kids, and they can't get an apartment, and he can't actually get on a plane because his status has been revoked in that regard. If you've never seen the Black Mirror episode, it's crazy because it's essentially now happening in real life.
Cryptocurrencies might help them.
Maybe. I don't know. Maybe.
Hi there.
Hi.
I'm just trying to look at this in the lens of from someone who's looked at kind of the auto industry and chemicals and the environment. When you're regulating something in those industries, you're regulating something that's got a real consequence, it's easily measurable, and it's got a big kind of financial implication. You can't just easily switch from one thing to another. Here it's ubiquitous. You can, it's invisible. It's kind of like it's a substitute for management decisions.
It's kind of been purposefully ubiquitous, though, because we haven't seen how these systems work until now we're starting to get under the hood, right?
So I'm just kind of wondering, how would you, have you thought around how would you go about identifying what is actually an AI decision, as opposed to the consequences of those decisions?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so I think it really depends case by case where you're using your AI and how you're using it. I think that's what I'm getting at, is that think that through. Where is the human intervention point? Why is it happening where it is? And what are the choices that human decision maker is making that then are going to be reflected within the machine learning that your system is going to produce something out the other end? I don't know if I've answered that at all. It feels like it's not real, but I would say that there's a lot of people that feel what's happened, particularly in the media industry, it is deeply real, and it's had profound impacts, including potentially an entire election based on some misuse of AI to some people's advantage in a system that wasn't being looked at even. Nobody even had the imagination to think that it could be that, we would be able to have that many people follow misinformation and disinformation and be swayed by it. It's now we have the hood open in some cases, and now I think those questions have to be asked. Where is that human intervention point in the AI? Who's the decision maker in that? Who's responsible and accountable if something goes feet up in it.
I was thinking about that red line question a bit after it was asked, in military applications and such, and made me step back a second and realize that most military tools, weapons, whatever, are built out of small components.
About which, sorry?
Or,
Small components?
small components that are potentially useful in other situations.
Yep.
So you could find yourself building an AI that is really good at, say, image recognition or targeting or driving or tracking, and you build that thing and you make it nice and modular and generic because you want it to be reusable in multiple applications, and all of a sudden you've easily contributed to a weapon, like a mobile tank that can just choose people and shoot people.
Mm-hmm.
Where at what level does what if someone builds on something that builds on something that builds on something that then is used in a military application? Where does the chain of responsibility end? Someone who builds a nail probably doesn't look at themselves as building something that could be used to make a warship or something.
Yeah, or if you're using a broom to sweep the floor and then somebody grabs it and knocks somebody out with it.
So I guess it's a pretty generic ethical question, but...
Yeah, but I think it's an incredibly important question. That's the crux of all of this. Where is that point? So lots of people talk about with military application and AI and drones being able to be sent off to kill people. There still has to be a human that makes that ultimate call. And that illustrates, I think, the problem with the self-regulation model, right? Where we can say that, but then if we rely on self-regulation, that will break. Somebody will push the button. Somebody will use CRISPR to create a baby. Somebody will, and so that's where as humanity, we need to define what those red lines are and not rely on just the creators of the technology. And where it goes back to who's ultimately responsible, that is a question that companies should be asking themselves. When I talk about the employees having, deep understanding of the ethical issues involved with the tools that they're making, that is part of what you, I think, should be building into your company culture so that folks are aware that it's not just, ones and zeros and has no impact, unless you're just making a broom, I guess. But those they are fundamentally deeply ethical humanity questions that we should be asking. We should have been asking 6 years ago, but we haven't necessarily up until this point. Oh.
Sorry, it's just a question from Facebook. Tim is asking, how has your transparency, how has your transparency policy been received by your customers?
So one of our clients is a newsroom, and what we've been advocating with them is, first of all, that first step for us is just changing the culture within the organization to stop saying, oh, it's just AI and somebody else will figure this out, but actually embracing it and figuring out that they have ownership and responsibility and accountability in that. So that is like the first step. We have not solved all these problems at all, but we're trying to aggressively tackle the parts that we can. So yeah, that's our first step. I don't know if anybody else has a company where you want to share what you're doing, but I think you take the pieces that you can and you implement them, beginning where you can. And so what we're doing, our customers tend to be media organizations that are fairly fixed on a legacy model of either broadcast or publishing, have looked at technology as a fairly distant, arm's length, innocuous, independent thing, and we're really rallying them around the idea that that's not the case, that they need to understand how these tools work, and they're actually embracing it. We were speaking at an event called the Online News Association a couple months ago, and I gave a talk similar to this, but about taxonomy, which isn't that exciting, but it actually is. And how, the folks in a newsroom need to understand how these systems are working. And so at like a very basic level in an editor's capacity, that's like the data that you're putting around your content is the first signal that's in the chain for our machine learning. And if you don't get that right and you don't understand how that's working, you don't have an understanding that we call it, maybe we call it politics, or maybe somebody else calls it municipal politics, then those are decisions that are being made that essentially affect what comes out the other end. So we're taking the approach of doing like lots of, lunch and learns and talking to folks in the space within their, within the work that they're doing and making it applicable and pertainable to what they are trying to get done. And that's where we're starting. I don't know how it would necessarily apply to the work that folks in the room are doing, but find something and start there is what I would advocate for.
So lots of great questions. I think we're out of time, though.
Lots of great questions. Loved it. Thank you.
And thank you, Tessa,
Thank
for the
you.
great presentation. And thank you to our audience, both in person and online, for viewing. Feel free to stick around and mingle. There's some food left over, maybe? No? I don't know. But,
Scraps.
Scraps. But thank you all.
Thanks.